The wind carried the smell of salt, sweat, and fear across the fields at Tilbury. It was August 1588. Across the Channel, the most powerful invasion fleet in Europe was moving toward England. Hundreds of Spanish ships had sailed under the banner of King Philip II. Their mission was simple: cross the sea, join an army waiting in the Netherlands, land on English soil, remove the woman on the throne, restore the old religion, and bring a rebellious kingdom to its knees. England was outnumbered. Its soldiers were poorly supplied. Its commanders did not know where the enemy would strike. Rumors spread through villages and London streets that the Spanish had already landed, that assassins were hiding near the Queen, that the kingdom had only days left. Then Elizabeth appeared before the troops. She was 54 years old. Her face was marked by age and illness. Her body was guarded, dressed in white velvet and silver armor. She rode among armed men who had been told that a woman could not command them, that a woman could not defend a kingdom, that a woman had no place at the center of war. Elizabeth looked at them and transformed weakness into a weapon. She told them she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. It became one of the most famous moments in English history. But the image hides the danger. Elizabeth had not been born secure. She had not been raised with the certainty that she would rule. Before she became the queen who faced the Spanish Armada, she had been declared illegitimate. Her mother had been executed. Her father had rejected her. Her brother's government had watched her. Her sister had imprisoned her. Men around her had used religion, marriage, and bloodline as reasons why she should never wear the crown. For most of her life, Elizabeth survived because she understood something that others learned too late. In the Tudor court, a careless sentence could become evidence. A friendship could become treason. A marriage could become a trap. And the distance between a palace and a prison cell could be crossed in a single night. By the end of her reign, poets would call her Gloriana. Painters would show her covered in pearls, holding rainbows, standing above maps and oceans. England would remember the theaters, the voyages, the victory over Spain, and the legend of a queen married to her kingdom. Yet behind the portraits stood a far more complicated woman. She could be brilliant and indecisive, merciful and ruthless, warm in private and terrifying in anger. She hated executions, but signed death warrants. She resisted war, but presided over years of violence. She protected her throne with words, spies, symbols, and blood. This is the story of how a child marked by scandal became one of the most powerful rulers of her age. It is also the story of what that survival demanded. Long before the Armada entered English waters, before the speeches and the portraits, before the name Elizabeth became inseparable from an age, there was another queen at the center of England's attention. Her name wasn't Boleyn. When Elizabeth was born at Greenwich Palace on September 7, 1533, the child was not the son her parents expected. King Henry VIII had broken with Rome, challenged the Pope, overturned the religious order of his kingdom, and ended his first marriage because he believed and would give him a male heir. The birth had been prepared as a triumph. Letters had been drafted announcing the arrival of a prince. Celebrations were ready. The royal household waited for news that the Tudor succession was safe. Instead, a red-haired girl entered the world. The letters were corrected. The word prince became princess. Elizabeth was still treated as royal. She was given her own household at Hatfield. She was dressed in expensive fabrics and surrounded by servants. Her parents presented her as the legitimate heir to the throne, while her older half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was pushed aside and declared illegitimate. But Elizabeth's security depended on and Boleyn's position. And Anne's position depended on producing a son. The Tudor dynasty was young. Henry VIII's father had won the crown in battle. Memories of civil war had not faded. A female succession appeared dangerous to many English nobles, not because women had no claim to rule, but because marriage could pull foreign powers into the center of government. A queen might marry a foreign prince. A husband might demand authority. Rival claimants might rise. The kingdom could fracture again, and became pregnant more than once, but no surviving son came. Henry's passion cooled. Court factions moved. The king's attention turned toward Jane Seymour. Then, in the spring of 1536, Anne's world collapsed with astonishing speed. She was accused of adultery with several men, including her own brother. She was accused of plotting the king's death. The charges were almost certainly constructed to remove her. Yet in Henry's England, evidence mattered less than royal will, and was taken to the Tower of London. On May 19, 1536, she walked to a scaffold inside the fortress and knelt before a swordsman brought from France. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Her mother was dead. Her parents' marriage was annulled, and the little girl who had once been presented as England's future was declared illegitimate. No one knows exactly how or when Elizabeth learned what had happened. There is no surviving record of the moment she understood that her mother had been executed by her father. But the shadow of Boleyn remained with her for the rest of her life. Elizabeth rarely spoke publicly about her mother. Silence was safer. Anne's enemies were still powerful, and Elizabeth's legitimacy remained politically dangerous. Yet symbols associated with and later appeared in Elizabeth's possessions. A ring believed to have belonged to Elizabeth contained miniature portraits of herself and another woman, possibly Anne. Whether or not every later story is true, one fact is unavoidable. Elizabeth grew up knowing that queens could fall. She learned that royal blood did not guarantee protection. She learned that a king's love could become a death sentence. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour only days after Anne's execution. Jane gave birth to the son he wanted, Edward, and then died shortly after childbirth. Elizabeth now had a younger half-brother who stood ahead of her in the succession. The king married again and again, and of Cleves arrived, then departed after an annulment. Catherine Howard rose, then was executed. Catherine Parr became Henry's final wife. For Elizabeth, each marriage changed the emotional weather of the court. A new queen could mean protection, suspicion, affection, or danger. The child watched women enter her father's life and disappear from it. Some left with wealth, some left without their heads. She also discovered that knowledge could provide a kind of armor. Elizabeth received one of the finest educations available to any royal child in Europe. Tutors trained her in Latin, Greek, French, Italian, rhetoric, history, theology, music, and the art of argument. She translated religious and classical works. She learned how language could conceal as much as it revealed. Her tutor Roger Ascham later praised the speed of her mind. She was not merely memorizing. She was learning how to read motives, compare claims, and control a conversation. The skills would save her life. Elizabeth's education also drew her toward the Protestant ideas spreading through parts of Europe. Her father had broken from Rome, but Henry's personal theology remained conservative in many ways. Under the surface, reformers and traditional Catholics competed for influence. Religion was no longer only a question of private belief. It was connected to loyalty, foreign alliances, property, rebellion, and succession. A person's prayer book could become political evidence. A sermon could be treated as a weapon. A royal marriage could change the faith of an entire kingdom. In 1543, Henry VIII restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession after Edward, though both daughters remained legally illegitimate. The decision did not heal the family, but it returned Elizabeth to the political future of England. Then, in January 1547, Henry VIII died. The throne passed to Edward VI, a boy of 9. For Elizabeth, the death of her father opened a new world. It also removed the one force powerful enough to control every ambition around her. Catherine Parr, Henry's widow, took Elizabeth into her household. Catherine was educated, Protestant, and for a time offered the teenage princess something close to a stable home. But Catherine soon married Thomas Seymour. Seymour was handsome, ambitious, reckless, and the uncle of the young king. He also began behaving toward Elizabeth in ways that alarmed the household. He entered her bedchamber early in the morning. He teased her. He touched her. On at least one occasion, Catherine Parr joined in a disturbing game in which Elizabeth's clothing was cut. The exact nature of the relationship remains debated, but the imbalance of power is clear. Elizabeth was a teenager. Seymour was an adult man with political ambition and access to her private rooms. Rumors began. Elizabeth was sent away. Catherine Parr became pregnant and died in 1548 after giving birth to a daughter. Seymour, now widowed, considered whether he might marry Elizabeth. Such a match could place him dangerously close to the throne. Then his schemes widened. He attempted to build influence around King Edward and was accused of plotting against the government led by his own brother, the Lord Protector Somerset. Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. And suddenly, the questions turned toward Elizabeth. Had she agreed to marry him? Had she known about his plans? Had she exchanged messages with him? Her servants were interrogated. Her household was searched. Elizabeth herself, only 15, faced experienced officials determined to uncover a conspiracy. She did not panic. She denied what she could deny. She demanded to know who had accused her. She avoided statements that could be twisted into confession. She understood that an innocent person could still be destroyed by a careless answer. Thomas Seymour was executed in 1549. Elizabeth survived, but the scandal changed her. It taught her the danger of sexual rumor. It taught her that marriage could become a struggle for control. It taught her that men might approach a princess not only because they desired her, but because they desired the power attached to her body. Years later, when ministers begged her to marry, Elizabeth would hesitate, delay, encourage, withdraw, and turn courtship into diplomacy. Perhaps no single experience explains that choice. But Thomas Seymour had shown her what could happen when a royal woman lost control of the story told about her. Meanwhile, Edward VI's government pushed England further toward Protestantism. Churches changed. Images were removed. Worship was rewritten. Old beliefs did not disappear, but the state demanded new public obedience. Edward was intelligent and intensely religious, yet his health was fragile. By early 1553, it became clear that the teenage king was dying. The succession now became a battlefield. According to Henry VIII arrangements, the crown should pass first to Mary and then to Elizabeth. But Mary was Catholic. Edward and his leading minister, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, feared that she would reverse the Protestant Reformation. A new plan was created. The crown would pass to Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin and Northumberland's daughter-in-law. When Edward died in July 1553, his death was briefly concealed while the government prepared Jane's accession. Mary moved quickly. She gathered supporters in East Anglia. Nobles and ordinary people rallied to Henry VIII's eldest daughter. The political nation changed sides. Jane Grey's reign lasted only 9 days. Mary entered London as queen. Elizabeth rode beside her. For a moment, the two daughters of Henry VIII appeared united. Both had been declared illegitimate. Both had been pushed aside. Both had survived the violent machinery of their father's court. But they represented different religious futures. And Mary had not forgotten that Elizabeth wasn't Boleyn's daughter. At first, Elizabeth publicly conformed to Mary's restoration of Catholic worship. She attended Mass, though her sincerity was questioned. Mary wanted to reverse the religious changes of Edward's reign and restore England to communion with Rome. She also intended to marry Philip, son of the Spanish Emperor Charles V and future King of Spain. The marriage terrified many English subjects. Some feared foreign control. Some feared Spanish troops. Some feared Catholic persecution. Some simply feared that Philip would rule through Mary and turn England into an extension of Habsburg power. In early 1554, rebellion broke out. The most serious rising was led by Thomas Wyatt in Kent. His forces marched toward London. The rebellion failed, but its consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Officials searched for evidence that Elizabeth had known about the plot. Letters were examined. Messengers were questioned. Accusations multiplied. Elizabeth was ill when orders came for her to travel to London. She understood what might be waiting. Lady Jane Grey had already been executed. Wyatt would soon be executed. The Tower of London had become the final destination of people whose blood made them dangerous. Before she was taken inside, Elizabeth wrote to Mary. The letter stretched across the page, and she drew lines through the empty space so that no one could add words after her signature. It was the act of a woman who knew that even blank paper could be used against her. She insisted on her innocence. She asked to speak to the Queen. Mary refused. On March 18, 1554, Elizabeth was taken by barge along the Thames and entered the Tower through the same fortress where her mother had spent her final days. Rain fell. Elizabeth protested that she was no traitor. The guards moved her inside. She was 20 years old. The exact conditions of her imprisonment were not those of a common criminal, but the danger was real. Interrogators pressed for connections to Wyatt. Some members of Mary's government wanted Elizabeth removed permanently. As long as she lived, Protestant opponents of Mary had a royal figure around whom they could gather. Wyatt was questioned before his execution. Statements were reported, revised, and disputed. But no clear proof emerged that Elizabeth had joined the rebellion. Mary faced a terrible problem. Executing Elizabeth without evidence could provoke outrage. Releasing her could leave a rival alive. Keeping her imprisoned admitted that the government feared her. Elizabeth waited. She walked in the Tower Garden under guard. She heard bells, footsteps, doors, and perhaps the distant movements of prisoners who would not leave alive. Every hour forced her to imagine the route her mother had taken. Then, after 2 months, she was removed from the tower and placed under house arrest at Woodstock. She was still watched. Her letters were controlled. Her servants were limited. But she had survived the fortress. Mary married Philip in July 1554. Soon afterward, the queen believed she was pregnant. The court prepared for a child. Official documents were written. A cradle was readied. If Mary gave birth to a healthy heir, Elizabeth's path to the throne might disappear forever. But no child came. The pregnancy was false. Mary's position weakened. Her government restored papal authority and revived laws against heresy. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were burned. The executions were intended to defend religious unity. Instead, they created martyrs and gave Protestant writers a powerful story of persecution. Elizabeth remained careful. She did not lead a resistance. She did not openly challenge Mary. She performed obedience when necessary and avoided giving her enemies the evidence they needed. The strategy frustrated supporters who wanted a clear Protestant champion. But Elizabeth was not yet queen. A dramatic gesture might have made her a martyr. Silence kept her alive. Mary's reign moved toward disaster. England entered war against France as an ally of Spain. In January 1558, English forces lost Calais, the kingdom's last major possession on the French mainland. Mary was devastated. Her health declined. Once again, rumors of pregnancy appeared. Once again, there was no child. By autumn, it was clear that Mary was dying. The woman she had imprisoned was about to inherit her crown. On November 17, 1558, Mary I died at St. James's Palace. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when messengers arrived. According to later tradition, she received the news beneath an oak tree. Whether the scene happened exactly that way is uncertain, but the truth behind it is dramatic enough. The former prisoner was now queen. She was 25 years old. She had no husband. She had no child. She inherited a divided country, a weakened treasury, a war with France, a disputed religious settlement, and enemies who questioned whether Boleyn's daughter had any legal right to rule. Around her, people celebrated. Elizabeth is said to have responded with words from Scripture. This was the Lord's doing, and it was marvelous in their eyes. But she understood what the celebration concealed. Surviving the road to the crown had been difficult. Remaining on it would be far more dangerous. Elizabeth began by choosing men who valued caution. The most important was William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh. Cecil was not a glamorous courtier. He was methodical, disciplined, Protestant, and deeply committed to the security of the realm. He would serve Elizabeth for most of her reign, reading reports, organizing policy, managing parliament, and repeatedly trying to push the queen toward decisions she preferred to postpone. Their partnership became one of the foundations of the government. It was not a relationship of simple agreement. Cecil wanted clarity. Elizabeth often wanted time. Cecil wanted threats removed. Elizabeth feared irreversible action. Cecil believed that delay could invite disaster. Elizabeth believed that delay could change the board. Both were often right. In November 1558, the new queen entered London to waves of public excitement. After years of religious fear and political uncertainty, many subjects projected their hopes onto her. Protestants saw rescue. Merchants saw stability. Courtiers saw opportunity. Catholics hoped she might be more moderate than the reformers around her. Elizabeth understood the power of public performance. Before her coronation, she traveled through London in a magnificent procession. Along the route, pageants presented her as the child of unity, the restorer of truth, the ruler who would heal a wounded nation. She stopped, listened, responded, and allowed the crowd to see her as accessible. This was not accidental. Elizabeth had spent years as a politically dangerous princess. She knew that affection could become protection. A monarch who inspired loyalty among ordinary subjects was harder to isolate inside a palace. On January 15, 1559, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony raised an immediate question. What religion would define the reign? England had been pulled through repeated changes. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. Edward VI had driven Protestant reform. Mary I had restored Catholicism. Every change had transformed worship, law, education, property, and the private lives of families. Elizabeth's own beliefs were Protestant, but she distrusted extremism. She wanted a national church under royal authority. She wanted outward obedience even where inner conviction differed. Most of all, she wanted to prevent religion from becoming a permanent civil war. The settlement of 1559 restored the monarch's authority over the English church. Elizabeth accepted the title supreme governor rather than supreme head, a choice that softened objections from those who disliked the idea of a woman holding spiritual authority. A new act of uniformity required the use of a revised Book of Common Prayer. The language was Protestant, but some wording allowed different interpretations. Certain traditional ornaments and practices survived. The settlement did not satisfy committed Catholics. It did not satisfy radical Protestants. That was partly the point. Elizabeth hoped that time and conformity would create peace. She did not initially seek to investigate every private belief. Attendance at church mattered. Public obedience mattered. What people thought in silence was harder to control and often less urgent. This approach has sometimes been described as moderation. But moderation in the 16th century still involved coercion. Catholic bishops who refused the settlement lost their offices. Clergy were required to conform. Fines punished absence from church. Printed words were controlled. The state would become harsher as rebellion, papal intervention, foreign invasion, and assassination plots connected Catholic identity with political danger. The settlement reduced immediate conflict. It did not end the religious struggle. It merely changed its shape. Elizabeth also needed peace with France. English finances were strained, and Calais was gone. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis ended the war in 1559. England surrendered its claim to recover Calais immediately, though the loss remained a wound to national pride. Peace bought time, and time was the resource Elizabeth valued most. But peace with France did not mean the French threat had disappeared. North of England, Scotland was ruled in the name of Mary Stuart by her mother, Mary of Guise. French troops supported the regency. Protestant Scottish lords, later known as the Lords of the Congregation, rebelled against Catholic authority and French influence. For Elizabeth, the crisis created an immediate test. The Protestant lords wanted English support. Cecil argued that a strong French position in Scotland could become a blade pointed directly at northern England. French forces might cross the border. Mary Stuart's claim to the English crown could be enforced by soldiers already on the island. The strategic answer appeared obvious. Help the Scots drive France out. The political answer was dangerous. The Scottish lords were subjects in rebellion against their lawful queen and regent. Elizabeth had only just taken the throne. If she publicly supported rebels against another monarch, what principle protected her from English rebels who claimed a religious cause? Once again, she hesitated between solidarity and sovereignty. Cecil pushed. Events pushed harder. English money and naval support began moving north. In 1560, England sent an army into Scotland. The campaign around Leith was difficult. English forces suffered casualties and setbacks. Siege warfare consumed time and supplies. Then Mary of Guise died. Negotiations followed. Under the Treaty of Edinburgh, French and English troops were to withdraw from Scotland. The agreement weakened French power and allowed the Scottish Protestant settlement to advance. It was a major strategic success for Elizabeth's new government. It was also built through intervention in another kingdom's internal conflict, the very method Elizabeth claimed to distrust. Mary Stuart never formally accepted the treaty. She did not surrender her claim to the English crown. The signatures missing from the document would haunt Anglo-Scottish relations for years. The Scottish crisis revealed the pattern of Elizabeth's foreign policy before Europe fully understood it. She would resist open war until fear overcame caution. She would support rebels without celebrating rebellion. She would offer enough assistance to prevent an enemy's victory, then resist the expense required for her allies' complete triumph. Her ministers called the method inconsistent. Her defenders called it survival. In truth, it was both. The same mixture defined religion at home. The settlement of 1559 created legal order, but law did not instantly change belief. In many parishes, people had lived through 4 official religious systems in less than 30 years. Altars had been removed, restored, and removed again. Priests had married, separated from wives, and sometimes married again. English prayer books replaced Latin services, disappeared under Mary, then returned under Elizabeth. For ordinary worshippers, theology arrived through changes in sound, sight, and habit. A familiar statue vanished. A wall painting was covered. The priest faced a different direction. Words once heard in Latin were spoken in English. Bread and wine carried arguments about the nature of Christ's presence that could lead scholars to prison and ordinary people into suspicion. Elizabeth preferred a degree of ceremony that some of her Protestant supporters disliked. She kept music in royal chapels. She sometimes displayed a crucifix. She valued order and beauty. Reformers who had lived in exile during Mary's reign returned with hopes for a more thoroughly Protestant church influenced by Geneva and other continental centers. They wanted simpler worship, stricter preaching, and the removal of vestments and practices they associated with Catholicism. Elizabeth refused to let individual clergy redesign the national church. To her, uniformity was not an invitation to endless reform. It was the end of argument. Archbishop Matthew Parker tried to enforce conformity among ministers. Some clergy lost positions over vestments. The dispute appeared minor to outsiders, but beneath clothing lay a larger question. Who controlled the church? Bishops? Parliament? Local congregations? Learned ministers? Or the Queen? Elizabeth's answer never changed. The church belonged to the royal settlement, and the royal settlement belonged to the crown. This brought her into conflict not only with Catholics, but with Protestants later described as Puritans. Some wanted further reform within the church. Others developed Presbyterian ideas that challenged the authority of bishops. A smaller number separated from the established church entirely. Elizabeth saw these movements as threats to unity. Radical Protestant writers could be censored, imprisoned, and, in rare cases, executed when authorities treated their arguments as seditious. The Queen, who had benefited from Protestant support, did not permit Protestants to define obedience for themselves. Her religious policy was built on a distinction she tried to preserve for as long as possible. Private belief might be tolerated when it remained quiet. Public defiance could not. But private belief rarely stayed private in an age when salvation, allegiance, family, and politics were joined. A Catholic household might hide vestments, books, or a priest. A Protestant household might hold unauthorized meetings or reject ceremonies. Neighbors noticed who attended church, who received communion, who named a child after a saint, who refused certain oaths, and who disappeared when officials arrived. Religion entered kitchens, bedrooms, wills, marriages, and burial customs. The state could demand outward conformity. It could not easily command memory. For the first decade of the reign, many Catholics continued attending parish churches while privately holding older beliefs. Elizabeth did not begin with a campaign to hunt every such person. The harsher phase came as foreign danger, rebellion, the papal bull, missionary priests, and plots convinced the government that hidden belief might become organized action. That shift was not inevitable in 1559. It emerged from fear. And once fear entered law, it became difficult to separate the innocent from the dangerous. This was the central problem of Elizabethan security. The Queen had survived because she knew accusations could be false. The Queen remained alive because her government treated some accusations as urgent. Almost at once, Parliament and the Privy Council began asking the question that would follow her for decades. Whom would the Queen marry? To many of her subjects, marriage was not a private matter. It was the center of national security. A husband might strengthen an alliance. A child might secure the succession. Without an heir, Elizabeth's death could trigger conflict among rival claimants. But every husband created danger. An English noble might become too powerful and divide the court. A foreign prince might drag England into war. A Catholic husband might threaten the religious settlement. A Protestant husband might provoke Catholic powers. A husband might expect to rule. And childbirth itself could kill her. Elizabeth had watched Catherine Parr die after childbirth. Jane Seymour had died after giving birth. Her grandmother Elizabeth of York had died following childbirth. For royal women, producing an heir was both duty and mortal risk. There was also one man already close to her. Robert Dudley. Dudley was charming, athletic, ambitious, and one of Elizabeth's oldest friends. They had known each other from youth. His family had nearly been destroyed after the attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Dudley's father and brother were executed, and Dudley himself had been imprisoned in the Tower. He understood survival. Elizabeth appointed him Master of the Horse, a position that kept him near her. They rode together. They danced. They spoke in private. Foreign ambassadors reported every glance and gesture because a queen's affection could alter European politics. There was one obvious obstacle. Robert Dudley was married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived away from court. On September 8, 1560, she was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place. The discovery created a storm. Had she fallen? Had she taken her own life? Had someone arranged her death so that Dudley could marry the queen? An inquest concluded that the death was accidental, though later medical interpretations and historical theories have continued to debate the circumstances. No evidence proves that Elizabeth or Dudley ordered Amy's death. But politics does not wait for proof. The scandal made marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley almost impossible. If she married him, people would say that a queen had rewarded murder. Foreign courts would treat the rumors as fact. English nobles would fear Dudley's dominance. Elizabeth continued to favor him. She later made him Earl of Leicester. Their relationship remained emotionally important, politically explosive, and never fully defined. The queen, who would become famous for never marrying, may have come closer to marriage with Dudley than with anyone else. But once again, survival demanded distance, and the kingdom still waited for an heir. In October 1562, the danger became immediate. Elizabeth contracted smallpox. At first, the illness was misjudged. Then her condition worsened. She developed fever and lost consciousness. Ministers gathered. The queen had no child. She had refused to name a successor. If she died, England might fall into a succession crisis before her body was cold. Elizabeth briefly recovered enough to indicate that Robert Dudley should be appointed protector of the realm. The choice revealed both trust and emotion. It also terrified men who believed Dudley would use the position to seize power. Then Elizabeth survived. Smallpox left marks on her face and may have contributed to the heavy white cosmetics associated with her later image. More importantly, the illness proved that the succession question could not be postponed forever. Parliament pressed her to marry or name an heir. Elizabeth resisted. She understood that naming a successor could create a second court around that person. Ambitious nobles might begin planning for the next reign. Foreign powers might support the heir against her. A named successor could become a living invitation to conspiracy. So she transformed uncertainty into control. She allowed marriage negotiations to rise and fall. Archdukes, princes, kings, and noblemen entered the conversation. The possibility of marriage became a diplomatic instrument. A courtship could delay an alliance against England. It could divide enemies. It could reassure one power and frighten another. Elizabeth flirted with Europe without surrendering herself to it. Her ministers found the strategy maddening. Her enemies found it difficult to predict. And her subjects began to imagine that the queen's unmarried state was not a failure, but a form of devotion. The myth of the Virgin Queen had begun. But another queen was moving toward the center of Elizabeth's reign. She was younger, Catholic, beautiful, and already a crowned monarch. Her name was Mary Stuart. And unlike Elizabeth, Mary had a claim to the English throne that many Catholics considered stronger than Elizabeth's own. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been crowned before she could walk. Her father, James V of Scotland, died when she was only days old. The infant became queen of a kingdom divided by noble rivalries and threatened by English pressure. To protect her from Henry VIII's attempts to force a marriage between Mary and his son, Edward, she was sent to France. There, Mary grew up inside one of Europe's most sophisticated courts. She learned French manners, music, poetry, and the ceremonies of monarchy. She married Francis, heir to the French throne, and in 1559 became Queen Consort of France. For a brief moment, Mary seemed to possess everything Elizabeth lacked. She was married. She was Catholic. She had powerful French relatives. And through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's elder sister, she had Tudor blood. Catholic rulers who rejected Henry VIII's marriage to and Boleyn considered Elizabeth illegitimate. To them, Mary Stuart was not merely Queen of Scotland. She was the rightful heir to England. When Mary I died in 1558, Mary Stuart and her husband used the English royal arms in their heraldry. It was a quiet image with an explosive meaning. Elizabeth could never forget it. Yet Mary's position changed quickly. Francis too died in 1560. Widowed at 18, Mary returned to Scotland the following year. The country she entered was no longer the country she had left. The Scottish Reformation had advanced. Protestant lords held power. The preacher John Knox denounced Catholic worship and the rule of women with uncompromising fury. Mary remained Catholic, but initially tried to govern through a degree of religious coexistence. Elizabeth watched from the south. She had reason to fear Mary, but she also recognized her as a fellow queen. Both women ruled in a world where many men believed female government unnatural or temporary. Both needed to perform authority without appearing unwomanly. Both understood that marriage could decide the future of a kingdom. Elizabeth tried to influence Mary's choice of husband. At one point, she even suggested Robert Dudley, a proposal so strange that it revealed the complexity of her diplomacy. If Mary married a man loyal to Elizabeth, perhaps the Scottish threat could be contained. Mary refused. In 1565, she married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley also carried Tudor blood. Their marriage united two claims to the English succession and alarmed Elizabeth. If Mary and Darnley had a son, that child would possess a powerful hereditary claim. At first, the marriage appeared passionate. Then it turned poisonous. Darnley wanted the crown matrimonial, authority that would allow him to rule Scotland alongside Mary and perhaps retain power if she died. Mary resisted. Darnley became jealous, violent, and involved with enemies of the Queen. In March 1566, conspirators led by Protestant lords burst into Mary's supper chamber at Holyrood Palace. Darnley was with them. Before the pregnant Queen, they seized her Italian secretary David Rizzio and stabbed him repeatedly. Mary survived. 3 months later, she gave birth to a son, James. The succession danger Elizabeth had feared was now alive in a cradle. Then the Scottish court descended into murder. In February 1567, Darnley was staying at Kirk O'Field near Edinburgh. An explosion destroyed the house. His body was found outside, apparently strangled or suffocated rather than killed by the blast. Suspicion fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, one of Mary's leading nobles. Only months later, Mary married Bothwell. Whether she acted freely, under pressure, after abduction, or through some mixture of political calculation and coercion remains debated. But the marriage destroyed her authority. Scottish lords rebelled. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Imprisoned at Loch Leven, she escaped, raised an army, lost at Langside, and made the decision that would shape the rest of Elizabeth's reign. She fled to England. Mary believed Elizabeth might help restore a fellow queen. Instead, Elizabeth faced an impossible choice. If she sent Mary back to Scotland, she might be killed. If she restored her by force, England would be supporting a Catholic ruler against Protestant Scottish lords. If she allowed Mary to travel abroad, France or Spain might use her claim against England. If she kept Mary in England, she would be holding an anointed queen without trial. Elizabeth chose captivity. Mary would remain in England for nearly 19 years. She lived in castles and manor houses rather than a dungeon. She had servants, furniture, food, correspondence, and the dignity of rank. But guards watched her. Her movements were restricted. Her letters were intercepted when possible. Her existence became a permanent crisis. Every Catholic rebellion could invoke her name. Every foreign invasion plan could place her at its center. Every assassin could imagine that killing Elizabeth would free Mary to take the throne. The two queens never met. They exchanged messages, accusations, compliments, and calculated expressions of affection. Elizabeth sometimes called Mary her cousin and sister. Mary demanded recognition and freedom. Each woman understood that the other represented an alternative future. While Mary waited, conflict erupted in northern England. In 1569, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland led a rebellion. The North remained more deeply attached to Catholic traditions than many southern regions. The rebels entered Durham Cathedral, destroyed Protestant service books, restored the Mass, and called supporters to arms. Their exact aims were not perfectly unified, but Mary Stuart stood at the center of their hopes. Some wanted to free her. Some imagined her marriage to the Duke of Norfolk, England's most powerful noble. Some wanted to reverse the religious settlement. Elizabeth's forces crushed the rising. The punishment was severe. Hundreds were executed across the north. Bodies were displayed as warnings. The queen, who disliked bloodshed, understood that rebellion had to look hopeless. Then, in 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her deprived of her claimed title. The document changed the political temperature. For Catholics loyal to Elizabeth, it created a painful conflict between obedience to the Pope and obedience to the Queen. For the English government, it appeared to release subjects from allegiance and give spiritual support to rebellion. From this point, Catholicism increasingly became entangled with questions of treason. That did not mean every Catholic was a traitor. Most were not. Many English Catholics continued to live quietly and remained loyal to the crown. But the government could no longer treat religious difference as only a private matter when foreign powers and conspirators used faith as a language of regime change. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 deepened the fear. Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker, carried messages connecting English Catholic nobles with the Duke of Alba in the Spanish Netherlands and with papal support. The plan involved an invasion, the removal of Elizabeth, and the elevation of Mary Stuart, likely through marriage to the Duke of Norfolk. The conspiracy was uncovered. Norfolk was arrested, tried, and condemned. Elizabeth hesitated before allowing his execution. Norfolk was her cousin, the highest-ranking peer in England, and the first duke to be executed during her reign. She signed the warrant, withdrew it, and delayed. Her ministers saw weakness. Elizabeth saw the irreversible weight of killing an anointed noble. Finally, in June 1572, Norfolk was executed on Tower Hill. The line around Mary tightened. Yet Elizabeth still refused to execute the Scottish queen. Part of her hesitation was personal. If subjects could lawfully kill one queen, what did that teach them about another? Monarchy depended on the sacred distance between disagreement and regicide. Elizabeth feared creating a precedent that could return against her. She also feared Mary's son. James VI was being raised Protestant in Scotland. If Elizabeth executed his mother, would he become an enemy? If she kept Mary alive, could James be separated from her claim? The Queen preferred possibilities to final decisions. Her advisors had less patience. The most formidable security official to rise during these years was Francis Walsingham. Walsingham had witnessed religious violence in France. In August 1572, during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, thousands of French Protestants were killed in Paris and across the kingdom. The scale and speed of the bloodshed convinced many English Protestants that Catholic powers might one day attempt the same destruction in England. Walsingham did not view espionage as dishonorable. He viewed ignorance as fatal. He built networks of agents across Europe. Merchants, diplomats, refugees, couriers, servants, and double agents carried information. Codes were broken. Letters were opened, copied, resealed, and allowed to continue toward their recipients. Walsingham understood that a conspiracy could be more useful if watched than if stopped too early. Elizabeth's government began to see threats before they reached the palace. But this protection had a cost. The state became more suspicious. Catholic priests trained abroad and entering England were treated as potential agents of foreign power. Laws grew harsher. Seminary priests faced execution if convicted under treason statutes. Those who sheltered them risked severe punishment. Priests such as Edmund Campion insisted that their mission was religious, not political. The government argued that allegiance to Rome and denial of Elizabeth's religious authority made their presence inherently dangerous. Campion was captured in 1581, tortured, tried, and executed. To Protestants, he was a traitor. To Catholics, he was a martyr. The same execution produced two opposite histories, and Elizabeth ruled between them. While spies and priests fought in hidden rooms, the Queen transformed the visible surface of monarchy. Her court was not simply a place where government happened. It was a theater of power. Access to Elizabeth could create fortunes. A private conversation, a dance, a place near her chair, or a gift accepted with unusual warmth could signal favor. Courtiers competed through clothing, poetry, tournaments, architecture, and flattery. The Queen controlled this competition with extraordinary skill. She gave attention without always giving decisions. She encouraged rivalries. then prevented any one faction from dominating completely. She could make a man feel chosen in the morning and ignored by nightfall. Her moods moved through the court like weather. Those who served her learned to read small signs. A ring removed, a nickname used, a door left open, a glance withheld. Elizabeth's own appearance became increasingly symbolic. After smallpox, white makeup helped conceal scarring and created the pale, almost mask-like face seen in later portraits. Her gowns expanded with jewels, embroidery, pearls, feathers, and fabrics designed to make her body appear less ordinary and more iconic. Pearls suggested purity. Suns and stars suggested divine order. Sieves referred to chastity. Globes and maps connected her image to exploration and imperial possibility. The aging woman disappeared behind the eternal queen. Portraits were political weapons. They traveled where Elizabeth could not. They presented control in a world of uncertainty. The queen could not stop time from changing her body, but she could command painters to show a face untouched by time. Her unmarried status became part of this design. At first, many subjects considered it a problem. As the years passed, poets and courtiers transformed it into a national myth. Elizabeth was not unmarried because no husband could be found. She was unmarried because England itself was her spouse. She told Parliament that she was already bound to a husband, the Kingdom of England. The statement was brilliant. It converted refusal into sacrifice. It made political necessity sound like love. Yet, marriage negotiations continued well into her 40s. One of the longest involved Francis, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the French king. He was Catholic, foreign, and considerably younger than Elizabeth. The proposed match divided the court and the country. Supporters believed it might secure a French alliance against Spain. Opponents feared Catholic influence and foreign domination. The pamphleteer John Stubbs attacked the marriage in print. The government punished him by cutting off his right hand. According to one account, after the blow fell, Stubbs raised his hat with his remaining hand and cried, "God save the Queen." The scene captured the contradictions of Elizabethan loyalty. A subject could condemn the Queen's policy, suffer mutilation by her government, and still insist that he loved her. Elizabeth appeared emotionally attached to Anjou. She called him her frog. In 1581, before the court, she kissed him and gave him a ring, creating the impression that marriage was imminent. Her ministers were stunned. Then the negotiations collapsed. Elizabeth watched Anjou leave England in 1582. She wrote a poem about the conflict between desire and duty, beginning with the idea that she grieved yet dared not show her discontent. Whether she loved him, loved the diplomatic game, feared loneliness, or felt all these things at once cannot be known with certainty. What is clear is that she did not marry. The kingdom remained without a named heir, and the Queen's body became a national clock. Every illness reminded England that time was running out. But Elizabeth did not rule only from palaces. She traveled. Royal progresses carried the court through towns, noble houses, universities, and country estates. They allowed subjects to see the Queen and allowed the Queen to see the resources, loyalties, and tensions of her realm. A progress was an honor for the host and often a financial disaster. Noble families spent enormous sums feeding hundreds of courtiers, constructing temporary entertainments, and offering gifts. A visit could display loyalty while quietly weakening a rival's wealth. Elizabeth enjoyed performance. At great houses, she watched plays, listened to speeches, received symbolic presents, and answered carefully designed pageants. At universities, scholars addressed her in Latin and Greek. She replied with enough command to remind educated men that the woman before them could meet them on their own ground. Crowds gathered along roads. People knelt. Petitions were offered. The Queen touched hands, spoke to children, and created moments that families remembered for generations. This contact did not make Elizabeth democratic. Her monarchy rested on hierarchy, inherited authority, and obedience. But she understood that power became stronger when it could be seen and felt. She called her subjects her people. They called her Good Queen Bess. The relationship was partly genuine and partly constructed. All successful monarchy is both. Beneath the court's splendor, England was changing rapidly. The population grew. Towns expanded. London became one of Europe's largest cities, crowded with merchants, apprentices, laborers, refugees, performers, thieves, and the poor. Printing spread arguments and stories. Grammar schools educated more boys. Trade connected English ports to the Baltic, the Mediterranean, West Africa, Russia, and the Atlantic world. The social order strained under pressure. Prices rose. Wages often failed to keep pace. Harvest failures in the 1590s brought hunger. Enclosure and changes in land use displaced some rural families. Former soldiers returned from war. Vagrancy became both a real social crisis and an object of elite fear. For the wealthy, Elizabeth's reign could look golden. For many poor subjects, gold was something worn by people passing in carriages. The government responded with a mixture of punishment and relief. Laws distinguished between those considered unable to work and those accused of refusing work. Parishes were given greater responsibility for raising money and supporting the poor. The Poor Law of 1601 helped organize a system of local relief that would endure, in changing form, for generations. But compassion and cruelty existed side by side. Beggars could be whipped. Vagrants could be branded or sent away. The state feared disorder as much as it feared suffering. Elizabeth's government also tried to repair the currency after earlier debasement. Trade expanded, though war and privateering blurred the line between commerce and theft. English merchants searched for routes that would bypass Iberian power. The Muscovy Company pursued trade with Russia. The Levant Company reached into the eastern Mediterranean. Adventurers imagined wealth beyond the Atlantic. These voyages would later be celebrated as the beginning of England's global rise. But their history was not clean. English seafarers entered systems of violence, raiding, forced labor, and human trafficking already expanding across the Atlantic. John Hawkins organized voyages that captured and purchased Africans, transported them across the ocean, and sold them in Spanish America. Elizabeth supported and invested in some of Hawkins's ventures, and a ship connected to the Queen was used in the enterprise. This was an early English involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. It cannot be separated from the wealth and maritime ambition later associated with the Elizabethan age. The same court that celebrated classical learning and poetic beauty also profited from human captivity. History remembers the ships. It must also remember the people forced beneath their decks. One of Hawkins's younger relatives, Francis Drake, became the most famous English seaman of the age. To the English, Drake was a hero. To the Spanish, he was a pirate. Both descriptions contained truth. After a disastrous encounter with Spanish forces at San Juan de Ulua in 1568, Drake developed a personal and political hatred of Spain. He raided Spanish ports and treasure routes. He attacked shipping in the Caribbean. He joined with escaped Africans known as Cimarrons in operations against Spanish power in Panama. In 1577, Drake sailed from England on a voyage that became one of the age's great legends. He passed through the Strait of Magellan, entered the Pacific, attacked Spanish settlements and ships, seized treasure, crossed the Pacific and Indian Oceans, rounded Africa, and returned to England in 1580. He had circumnavigated the globe. The voyage brought wealth, intelligence, and prestige. It also threatened open war with Spain. Elizabeth handled the moment with characteristic ambiguity. She accepted the treasure. She denied responsibility when useful. And in 1581, she boarded Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, and knighted him. The message was clear enough. England would reward those who weakened Spain, even while the Queen spoke the language of peace. Across the Atlantic, another courtier pursued a different dream. Walter Raleigh received royal favor and support for attempts to establish an English colony in North America. The land called Virginia was named in honor of the Virgin Queen. The Roanoke colonies struggled from the beginning. Supplies failed. Relations with indigenous peoples deteriorated. Colonists depended on communities they also threatened and misunderstood. One settlement was abandoned. Another vanished, leaving behind the word Croton carved into wood. The lost colony became a mystery. At the time, it was also a failure. England had not yet built a stable American empire. But the ideas, claims, maps, and ambitions developed under Elizabeth would outlive her. Exploration expanded the horizon of the kingdom. It also expanded the reach of conquest. At home, the horizon expanded on the stage. Public theaters rose outside the old city walls of London. Audiences from different ranks stood or sat together before plays filled with kings, ghosts, battles, fools, betrayal, and questions about power. Christopher Marlowe wrote Rulers Driven by Ambition. Edmund Spenser created poetic worlds that praised a figure resembling Elizabeth. William Shakespeare's companies performed histories that turned England's violent past into living drama. The Queen did not personally create this cultural explosion. Her government sometimes censored it. Theaters could be closed during plague outbreaks. Plays were watched for political danger. Yet the relative stability of her long reign helped create the space in which writers, actors, musicians, and printers could transform English culture. The theater taught audiences to look at a crown and ask what lay beneath it. Was a ruler made by blood? By performance? By public belief? Elizabeth had spent her life answering those questions without saying them aloud. Her rule was itself a performance of monarchy. But while London applauded actors and seamen returned with treasure, a continental struggle was moving closer. The Netherlands had rebelled against Spanish rule. Protestant provinces resisted Philip II's armies. Spanish soldiers fought to restore authority. Cities were besieged. Refugees fled. Reports of massacre and persecution crossed the Channel. Elizabeth feared Spanish domination of the Netherlands. If Philip controlled the entire coast opposite England, invasion would become easier. English trade would suffer. Protestant allies would fall. Yet she also feared rebellion as a principle. She was a monarch. Supporting subjects against their king could legitimize revolt everywhere, including England. So she hesitated. She sent money quietly. She allowed volunteers to fight. She negotiated. She withdrew. She tried to prevent Spain from winning without openly declaring war. To her ministers, this caution sometimes looked like paralysis. To Elizabeth, it was the narrow path between danger and disaster. But events kept closing the path. In 1584, William of Orange, leader of the Dutch revolt, was assassinated. The French Catholic League grew stronger. Spain's position appeared increasingly dominant. Then an agreement between France's Catholic enemies and Philip II threatened to isolate England. Elizabeth finally acted. In 1585, she signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, promising troops and support to the Dutch rebels. It was effectively a declaration of war against Spain. She placed Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in command of the English expedition. Leicester crossed to the Netherlands with ambition and ceremony. Dutch leaders offered him the title of Governor-General. He accepted without Elizabeth's permission. The Queen exploded in anger. She had authorized assistance, not the creation of an independent princely position for her favorite. Publicly, the dispute weakened English leadership. Militarily, the campaign struggled with money, supplies, divided command, and conflicting goals. Leicester returned to England with limited success. The war Elizabeth had delayed was now unavoidable. Philip II had multiple reasons to move against her. English privateers attacked Spanish wealth. Elizabeth supported Dutch rebels. Her government executed Catholic priests. The Pope had declared her deposed. Mary Stuart remained a potential replacement. By then, the machinery of conspiracy had been turning for years. In 1583, Francis Throckmorton, a young English Catholic from a well-connected family, became part of a plan linking supporters of Mary Stuart with foreign intervention. The scheme imagined an invasion led by the French Duke of Guise, financial and military help from Spain, an uprising by English Catholics, the release of Mary, and the overthrow of Elizabeth. The pieces crossed borders. Messages moved through ambassadors' houses. Names were hidden behind codes. Foreign armies existed first as sentences on paper. Walsingham's agents watched Throckmorton. His movements were followed. His contacts were noted. His house was searched. Incriminating materials were found, including lists and coded information that helped expose the network. Under interrogation and torture, Throckmorton confessed, withdrew parts of his confession, and was condemned. He was executed in 1584. The Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza was expelled from England for involvement. Diplomatic relations moved closer to open hostility. From abroad, Mendoza continued supporting efforts against Elizabeth. The plot demonstrated something terrifying to the council. Mary did not need to personally command every operation. As long as she existed, men in England and Europe could design invasions around her claim. Her name functioned like a key. It could unlock money from Spain, soldiers from France, hope among Catholic exiles, and fear inside the English government. That same year, The assassination of William of Orange transformed fear into urgency. William had led Dutch resistance against Spain. A Catholic assassin, Balthasar Gerard, shot him at close range in Delft. Gerard was captured and executed, but the political message crossed Europe immediately. A ruler protected by guards, walls, and public loyalty could still be killed by one determined man. Elizabeth's council imagined the same pistol, knife, or poison reaching their queen. The threat was not fantasy. Foreign governments had discussed removing Elizabeth. Exiles defended tyrannicide. Men crossed borders with plans. Her public appearances, progresses, and habit of moving among crowds created both political strength and physical vulnerability. The council responded with the Bond of Association in 1584. Those who signed pledged to pursue and destroy anyone involved in an attempt on Elizabeth's life, including any claimant who might benefit from the assassination. The bond was emotional, political, and menacing. It asked subjects to imagine the queen already dead and to promise vengeance in advance. Parliament followed with legislation intended to protect the queen's safety. A claimant to the throne could face exclusion and punishment if involved in, or benefiting from, a plot against Elizabeth. The legal path toward trying Mary Stuart was being constructed before the final evidence arrived. Mary understood what was happening. Her captivity became stricter. Trusted servants were removed. Movement narrowed. Correspondence became more difficult. She aged inside houses chosen by other people, receiving reports of plots she could not fully control and promises she could not safely trust. She had entered England believing one queen would assist another. Years later, she knew that Elizabeth's ministers considered her continued breathing a national emergency. Elizabeth continued resisting the conclusion they wanted. She could order Mary's guards increased. She could allow laws aimed at Mary's claim. She could accuse the Scottish queen of ingratitude. But execution remained a boundary. Walsingham prepared for the day when the boundary could be crossed. His intelligence system did not resemble a modern agency with a single office and fixed budget. It was a web of personal relationships, payments, diplomatic posts, merchant routes, religious refugees, informers, and specialists. Some agents served from conviction. Some served for money. Some played both sides. The network extended into France, the Low Countries, Italy, Spain, Scotland, and the English Catholic exile communities. Reports arrived in different languages and ciphers. Walsingham compared fragments, searched for patterns, and tried to separate genuine danger from deliberate misinformation. It was expensive work, and he sometimes paid from his own resources. Intelligence offered no perfect safety. An agent could lie. A prisoner could confess under torture to something that was not true. A double agent could create the plot he claimed to discover. A minister desperate for proof could begin seeing conspiracy everywhere. But Walsingham had lived through the massacre of French Protestants. To him, the greater moral failure was not excessive suspicion. It was allowing enemies to strike first. In 1585, another alleged assassination plan emerged around William Parry, a former member of Parliament with complicated loyalties and contacts. Parry had discussed killing Elizabeth and claimed religious justification. He was arrested, tried, and executed. Questions remained about his motives, his shifting statements, and the role of government agents. But the public lesson was simple. The Queen's life was under attack. The government used each discovery to strengthen obedience. Sermons warned subjects. Proclamations described enemies. Executions turned hidden plans into public theater. The scaffold did not only punish a traitor. It taught the crowd how close catastrophe had come. Yet repeated warnings created their own danger. A population told constantly that invasion and assassination were imminent might unite around the Queen. It might also become suspicious of neighbors, foreigners, travelers, and religious minorities. Fear defended the regime. Fear also changed it. By 1586, Mary Stuart had been held in England for almost 18 years. Many of her early allies were dead, defeated, or discouraged. Her health was weaker. Her freedom seemed more distant than ever. This made her less harmless, not more. A prisoner with no ordinary future may accept risks that a free ruler would reject. Walsingham's opportunity came when Mary's communications were restricted so tightly that she was desperate for a secret route. A new channel appeared. Letters could be concealed in a waterproof packet and carried inside a beer barrel moving. In and out of Chartley Manor, where Mary was held. The arrangement seemed ingenious. It was controlled by Walsingham's agents. Mary believed a wall had opened. In reality, the wall had become a window through which the government watched everything. Thomas Philippes, a skilled cryptanalyst, deciphered Mary's messages. Letters were copied before being delivered. Seals and folds were handled carefully. The network allowed conspirators to speak because silence would have revealed less. This was not merely the discovery of a plot. It was the cultivation of one. Walsingham waited for the language to become clear enough that even Elizabeth could not look away. And then he uncovered the plot that would force her toward the decision she had avoided for almost 2 decades. A trap was built around Mary, Queen of Scots. Her correspondence had been restricted, but a secret channel was created using letters hidden in beer barrels. Mary believed she was communicating safely with Catholic supporters outside her captivity. She was not. Walsingham's agents controlled the route. They opened the letters, copied them, decoded them, and allowed the exchange to continue. Among the conspirators was Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman. The plan involved foreign invasion, the rescue of Mary, and the assassination of Elizabeth. Babington wrote to Mary. Mary replied. Her response approved efforts for her freedom and discussed the necessary preparations. The exact wording, additions made by Walsingham's secretary, and the degree to which the evidence was manipulated have been debated. But the government now possessed what it needed to connect Mary to a plot against Elizabeth's life. Babington and his associates were arrested. They were executed with such brutality that even Elizabeth reportedly ordered later executions in the group to be completed more quickly. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle and placed on trial in October 1586. She denied that an English court had authority over her. She was a foreign queen, she argued, not an English subject. She had no legal counsel. Her papers had been taken. She faced men who had already concluded that her existence endangered the realm. Mary defended herself with intelligence and courage. It did not save her. She was found guilty of complicity in the plot. Parliament demanded execution. Elizabeth refused to move quickly. Her hesitation has been interpreted in different ways. Perhaps she genuinely recoiled from killing a fellow queen. Perhaps she feared international consequences. Perhaps she wanted Mary dead, but did not want responsibility for ordering it. Perhaps all of these were true. She pressured Mary's jailer to consider removing the problem privately. He refused. Finally, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Then she delayed again. Her secretary William Davison, working with members of the Privy Council, sent the warrant forward. The council arranged the execution before Elizabeth could reverse herself. On February 8, 1587, Mary entered the Great Hall at Fotheringhay. She wore black outer clothing. Beneath it was crimson, a color associated with Catholic martyrdom. She prayed. She forgave her executioners. She knelt at the block. The first stroke missed its clean purpose. The second nearly completed it. A third cut separated her head. When the executioner lifted what he thought was her hair, the wig came away and the head fell. Mary Stuart was 44 years old. Elizabeth reacted with fury when news reached her. Davison was imprisoned and fined. The Queen insisted that the execution had been carried out against her intentions. Her ministers had protected the state. They had also protected Elizabeth from the final moment of decision by making the decision impossible to undo. Mary's death removed a living focus for conspiracy. It also gave Catholic Europe a martyr. Philip II accelerated preparations for invasion. The execution Elizabeth had delayed for 19 years did not end the danger. It brought the danger to England's coast. Spain was not merely another European kingdom. Under Philip II, it stood at the center of a global monarchy. Spanish power reached across the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, the Netherlands, the Americas, and the Pacific. Silver crossed the Atlantic. Armies fought on multiple fronts. Philip saw himself as the defender of Catholic Christendom, a ruler burdened with the duty to preserve order and faith. England, by comparison, was smaller, poorer, and dangerously exposed. The invasion plan was enormous. A fleet would sail from Spain through the English Channel. It would secure control of the waters long enough to meet the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands. Parma's experienced troops would cross to England, land near the Thames, advance toward London, remove Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. The operation depended on timing, communication, weather, and coordination across hundreds of miles. It also depended on England failing to interfere. Philip called his fleet the Great and Most Fortunate Navy. History would remember it by another name, the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth's council had known for months that preparations were underway. English spies sent reports. Merchants described shipbuilding. Ports in Spain filled with supplies, weapons, sailors, soldiers, priests, and expectations. Francis Drake argued that the best defense was attack. In April 1587, before the Armada was ready, he sailed into Cadiz and struck the Spanish fleet in harbor. Ships and supplies were destroyed. The raid delayed the invasion and humiliated Philip. Drake called it singeing the king of Spain's beard. It was a bold success. It was not a permanent solution. Spain rebuilt. By the spring of 1588, the Armada was preparing to sail under the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was a great nobleman, but not an experienced naval commander. He had warned Philip about the plan's weaknesses. The king insisted. The fleet left Lisbon in May, encountered storms, returned for repairs, and sailed again in July. In England, uncertainty became fear. Coastal beacons were prepared. Militias assembled. Weapons were counted. Messages moved along roads. The government struggled to supply ships and soldiers because Elizabeth's habit of economy had left military systems stretched thin. The Queen disliked waste. She questioned expenses. She delayed payments. In peace, caution protected the treasury. In war, it could leave men hungry. English commanders gathered at Plymouth when the first reports arrived. Legend later claimed that Drake calmly finished a game of bowls before sailing out to fight. The story may be embellished, but its survival reveals how England wanted to remember the moment. Confidence facing overwhelming power. The English fleet was led by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher among the senior commanders. Their ships were generally more maneuverable than many Spanish vessels. English guns could fire at longer range, and crews had developed tactics based on repeated broadsides rather than closing quickly for boarding. But Spain's fleet remained formidable. When the Armada entered the Channel, it formed a vast crescent. Large ships protected the formation. The English followed, firing from distance and searching for weakness. The first engagements did not destroy the Armada. Spanish discipline held. The fleet moved eastward toward its meeting with Parma. This was the heart of the danger. The English could harass the Spanish. They had not yet stopped them. At Calais, the Armada anchored and waited for communication from the Netherlands. But Parma's army was not ready to move. Dutch ships blocked shallow coastal waters. The Spanish fleet lacked a secure deep-water port. Messages took time. The invasion machine had reached the point where every separate part needed to move together. It did not. On the night of August 7th, the English sent fireships toward the anchored Armada. The Spanish had feared such an attack. In darkness, with flames approaching, captains cut anchor cables to escape. The crescent formation broke. Ships scattered. The next day, off Gravelines, the English attacked. This was the decisive battle. English ships moved close enough to make their gunfire more effective. Spanish vessels answered. Smoke covered the water. Cannon tore through timber. Men were crushed by splinters, thrown from rigging, or killed at gun positions. Several Spanish ships were badly damaged. Ammunition ran low. The fleet was pushed away from Parma's army and toward dangerous northern waters. Yet the English did not completely annihilate it. The Armada still possessed many ships. Its soldiers had not landed. Its invasion plan had failed, but the fleet had to escape. Wind and geography now took command. Unable to return through the Channel, the Spanish sailed north around Scotland and Ireland. Their charts were inadequate for the route. Ships were damaged. Crews were sick. Food and water spoiled. Storms drove vessels toward rocky coasts. Dozens of ships were lost. Thousands of men died from battle wounds, disease, hunger, drowning, and exposure. Some survivors reached Ireland and came ashore. Local people sometimes helped them. English authorities hunted them. Many were killed. The weather became part of Protestant memory. Medals declared that God had blown and scattered the enemy. The victory appeared to confirm that England, its queen, and its religion stood under divine protection. But before the outcome was known, Elizabeth had prepared for the possibility of invasion. At Tilbury, troops gathered to defend the approach to London. The Queen's advisors worried about her safety. An assassin might be among the soldiers. The Spanish might still land. Elizabeth went anyway. She rode before the army and spoke of trust. She told them she did not desire to live in distrust of her faithful people. She acknowledged the body of a woman and claimed the heart of a king. The speech fused gender, courage, and monarchy into a single image. Elizabeth did not pretend she was physically a man. She turned the prejudice against female rule into evidence of extraordinary resolve. She would stand among her subjects. She would live or die with them. Her royal body and the body of the nation became one. The Armada had already been driven north by the time of the speech, though no one at Tilbury could yet know the full outcome. When victory became clear, England celebrated. Church bells rang. Sermons praised Providence. Processions turned survival into national theater. Portraits and engravings showed Elizabeth above the storm, serene while enemy ships broke beneath her. The defeat of the Armada became the central legend of her reign. But legends simplify. The victory was not achieved by the Queen alone. It depended on sailors, gunners, shipbuilders, informants, Dutch resistance, Spanish logistical failures, and weather. English planning had strengths, but the government also failed its own men. After the fleet returned, many sailors were sick and unpaid. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread. Men who had defended the kingdom begged for wages and medical care. Commanders pleaded for money. Elizabeth's government, frightened of expense and fraud, responded too slowly. The nation celebrated while some of its defenders died in port. History remembers the victory. It often forgets the cost. The defeat of 1588 also did not end the war. Spain remained powerful. Philip rebuilt fleets. English coasts continued to fear attack. The struggle would continue for the rest of Elizabeth's life. Robert Dudley did not live to see that long aftermath. After serving at Tilbury, he became ill while traveling and died in September 1588. Elizabeth kept his final letter among her personal possessions, marked as his last letter. The man who had been her companion, favorite, possible husband, political risk, and emotional refuge was gone. For nearly 30 years, their relationship had survived scandal, jealousy, diplomatic calculation, and time. Whatever its private nature, Dudley's death left a space no courtier could fully fill. Elizabeth's public image grew stronger after the Armada. Her private world became lonelier. In 1589, England launched a counteroffensive now known as the English Armada. Drake and John Norris led a large expedition toward the Iberian Peninsula. Their goals included destroying Spanish ships, encouraging revolt in Portugal, and seizing strategic advantage. The operation failed. Disease, poor coordination, weak intelligence, conflicting priorities, and inadequate supplies devastated the force. Thousands died. The expedition returned without achieving its main objectives. The failure never occupied the same place in national memory as the victory of the previous year. Triumph received paintings. Disaster received silence. And still the war widened. The conflict was not fought only on the ocean. France had entered another cycle of religious and dynastic crisis. After the assassination of Henry III in 1589, the strongest claimant to the French throne was Henry of Navarre, a Protestant. Catholic forces rejected him, and Spain supported his enemies. Elizabeth could not allow Philip II to dominate France as well as the Netherlands. A Spanish-backed power across the Channel would surround England with hostile ports. So English money and troops went to support Henry. Once again, Elizabeth faced the contradiction that defined her foreign policy. She hated rebellion and distrusted expensive continental wars, yet England's security depended on preventing Spain from crushing those who resisted it. English soldiers fought in Normandy and Brittany. They besieged towns, marched through rain, waited for pay, and died far from home. Commanders complained that the Queen promised too little, too late. Elizabeth complained that commanders wasted what she sent. The arguments repeated themselves. A general demanded men. The Queen demanded proof. An ally demanded immediate support. Elizabeth asked whether the ally would still be useful tomorrow. Her caution prevented England from pouring unlimited resources into every crisis. It also left expeditions underfunded and allies uncertain. In 1593, Henry of Navarre converted to Catholicism, reportedly judging that the crown of France was worth a Massachusetts. The decision shocked some Protestants but opened the path to wider acceptance. He was crowned Henry IV and continued fighting until his position strengthened. Elizabeth had supported a Protestant claimant. She now had to support a Catholic king against a more dangerous Catholic enemy. That was the reality beneath Europe's wars of religion. Faith mattered profoundly, but strategy could rearrange loyalties overnight. At sea, English privateering became a national gamble. Investors purchased shares in voyages. Merchants, courtiers, officials, and sometimes the Queen herself hoped that captured Spanish treasure would pay for war. A single prize could create a fortune. A failed voyage could ruin families. Ships left harbor carrying cannon, trade goods, letters of authority, and dreams of silver. Some returned with captured cargo. Some returned damaged and empty. Some never returned. The government encouraged private violence because it could weaken Spain without requiring the crown to fund every ship directly. But privateering created its own disorder. Captains pursued profit instead of strategy. Crews suffered brutal discipline. Neutral merchants could be attacked. The boundary between licensed warfare and piracy remained thin. English propaganda presented the struggle as Protestant liberty against Spanish tyranny. Spanish propaganda presented Elizabeth as a heretic protected by thieves. Neither side needed to invent every accusation. In 1591, an English squadron near the Azores encountered a much larger Spanish fleet. Most English ships escaped, but the Revenge, commanded by Sir Richard Grenville, remained and fought alone for hours before surrendering. Grenville died from his wounds. The battle was a defeat. English writers transformed it into a story of heroic resistance. The pattern returned. When England won, victory proved divine favor. When England lost, courage became the victory. Nations are skilled at protecting the meaning of war from the evidence of war. Spain also attempted to rebuild the invasion threat. New fleets were prepared. English intelligence followed ship movements. Coastal communities repaired defenses. Rumors of sails could send councils into panic. In 1596, a Spanish Armada intended for Ireland was broken by storms before it could achieve its purpose. Another attempted fleet in 1597 was also scattered. To English memory, weather had saved the kingdom in 1588. In later years, weather continued to defend it. But no one living on the coast could assume the next storm would arrive in time. In 1596, England struck Cadiz again. The expedition was led by Lord Howard and the Earl of Essex. English and Dutch forces entered the harbor, destroyed or captured ships, landed troops, and seized the city. For Essex, it was the glorious campaign he had wanted. He fought visibly, took risks, and returned with the reputation of a warrior favored by Providence. Yet the operation did not capture the entire treasure fleet, and the occupation ended with Cadiz burned and looted. Civilians suffered. The raid damaged Spanish resources and prestige, but it did not force Philip from the war. Essex returned to court expecting his achievement to translate into permanent influence. Elizabeth celebrated success but refused to let victory free a servant from dependence. She questioned costs, rewards, and claims. Essex believed glory entitled him to trust. Elizabeth believed all glory still belonged to the crown. The difference between them deepened. The following year, Essex joined another major naval operation, later called the Islands Voyage. Its goals included intercepting Spanish treasure and attacking the Azores. Storms separated ships. Opportunities were missed. The treasure fleet escaped. Essex returned without the triumph he had promised. His admirers blamed weather and divided command. His enemies blamed vanity and incompetence. The Queen saw another expensive expedition whose result did not equal its cost. The war was creating reputations faster than it created victory. It also changed daily life inside England. Ports filled with wounded sailors, prisoners, foreign merchants, refugees, and rumors. Shipyards demanded timber, rope, canvas, iron, and labor. Taxes touched counties far from the sea. Households supplied horses, carts, weapons, and men. Musters gathered local militias for inspection. Many weapons were old. Some men had little training. Officers exaggerated numbers. Communities argued over who should serve and who could pay to avoid service. War did not arrive only as a Spanish ship on the horizon. It arrived as a tax collector, a missing son, a higher price for grain, a wounded sailor at a parish door, a proclamation read in the marketplace, a rumor whispered after church. Elizabeth's speeches and portraits gave the conflict a face. The burden was carried by thousands whose names never entered the official story. The Queen understood the power of their loyalty, but she never fully solved the financial system that exploited it. The Crown sold lands, borrowed money, granted monopolies, and demanded subsidies from Parliament. Each solution weakened another part of royal independence. The Tudor monarchy looked magnificent. Its finances were often fragile. Elizabeth's instinct for economy had helped prevent reckless spending in earlier decades. The same instinct became increasingly difficult to maintain once war existed on several fronts. She examined bills closely. She challenged commanders. She delayed commitments. She accused officials of corruption and sometimes had good reason. Military supply invited fraud. Contractors charged for goods that never arrived. Captains listed men who did not exist and collected their pay. Local officials shifted burdens onto poorer neighbors. But suspicion could not feed an army. Every delay traveled downward until it reached a soldier without shoes or a sailor without wages. The Queen, who had mastered political time, could not stop hunger from keeping its own schedule. By the middle of the 1590s, the struggle against Spain had become more than a defensive emergency. It was a permanent condition. A generation of young nobles had grown up believing that honor came through war. They wanted commands, prizes, and heroic names. Elizabeth, who remembered how quickly kingdoms could collapse, distrusted their appetite. She had survived by avoiding the dramatic gamble. They wanted to become famous by taking it. No one represented that conflict more clearly than Essex. The court still glittered. Young men still competed for attention. But the Queen was aging, and the people who had known her before the crown were disappearing. Francis Walsingham died in 1590, leaving debts after years of service. Christopher Hatton died in 1591. William Cecil grew old. A new generation entered the court, ambitious and impatient. Knowing Elizabeth not as the uncertain young queen of 1558, but as an institution that appeared to have always existed. Among them was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. He was Robert Dudley's stepson, young, handsome, proud, and hungry for glory. Elizabeth favored him. He became her companion at court and a symbol of martial energy. Their relationship mixed affection, politics, performance, and conflict. Essex wanted command. He wanted fame. He wanted the Queen to trust his judgment. Elizabeth wanted loyalty without independence. She liked bold men close enough to entertain her, but not powerful enough to escape control. The tension would eventually destroy him. Before that final collision, England entered the difficult decade of the 1590s. Harvests failed repeatedly. Food prices rose. Disease returned. War drained the treasury. Taxes increased. Soldiers were pressed into service and sent abroad. Privateering produced spectacular prizes for a few and disappointment for many. The image of a golden age became harder to maintain. In London, theaters flourished while poor families struggled to buy bread. Plague closed playhouses and filled burial grounds. Apprentices crowded narrow streets. Authorities feared riots. Pamphlets blamed foreigners, landlords, grain dealers, vagrants, and moral decline. Elizabeth's long reign had created stability at the top. It could not protect every household below. The crown's financial weakness made the Queen dependent on methods that created resentment. One was the granting of monopolies, exclusive rights to produce or sell certain goods. Some monopolies rewarded servants without requiring immediate cash from the treasury. But they could raise prices and enrich favorites at public expense. Salt, starch, vinegar, cards, and other commodities became connected to monopoly privileges. Members of Parliament heard anger from towns and merchants. The issue would become one of the greatest domestic confrontations of Elizabeth's final years. The war with Spain also spread into Ireland, where English rule was limited, uneven, and deeply contested. Ireland was not a single political society waiting quietly to be governed from London. Gaelic lordships, old English families, local alliances, inherited rivalries, and regional systems of law shaped the island. The English crown claimed authority, but real control was strongest around Dublin and in certain towns and territories. Tudor governments attempted to expand that authority. They demanded submission, land surrender, English titles, legal change, and political obedience. Officials described the project as reform. For many Irish communities, it meant intrusion, dispossession, military occupation, and the destruction of established ways of life. Religion sharpened the conflict. As England became Protestant, Catholic identity in Ireland increasingly connected resistance to a wider European struggle. Earlier in Elizabeth's reign, the Desmond rebellions had devastated Munster. English forces used scorched earth tactics, destroyed crops, killed livestock, and contributed to famine and depopulation. After the rebellion, lands were confiscated and offered to English settlers and plantations. The policy promised control. It planted deeper resentment. In the north, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, emerged as the most formidable opponent of English expansion. He understood both Gaelic politics and the English court. He had been recognized within the Tudor system, but he built power carefully, trained forces, acquired weapons, and formed alliances. By the mid-1590s, open war spread. O'Neill and Hugh Roe O'Donnell led a confederation that defeated English forces and challenged the crown across much of Ireland. Their cause combined defense of regional power, resistance to English government, and Catholic appeal. The conflict became known as the 9 Years' War. For Elizabeth, it was a strategic nightmare. Ireland could become the landing ground for Spanish intervention. English armies had to be transported and supplied across the sea. Commanders complained about weather, terrain, corruption, disease, and unreliable intelligence. Campaigns consumed money at a rate the Queen hated. In 1598, an English army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of the Yellow Ford. Forces under Sir Henry Bagenal marched to relieve a fort on the River Blackwater. O'Neill's army prepared the ground, used trenches and obstacles, and attacked with disciplined gunfire. Bagenal was killed. The English force broke. The victory encouraged rebellion elsewhere and brought English authority in Ireland close to collapse. News reached a court already tense with faction. Elizabeth needed a commander with reputation, energy, and noble status. Essex wanted the role. In 1599, he was sent to Ireland with one of the largest armies England had ever dispatched there. Expectations were immense. So were the risks. Essex had enemies at court, especially Robert Cecil, the son of William Cecil. While the elder Cecil and Elizabeth had built the regime together, the younger Cecil represented administrative patience and political control. Essex represented honor, war, and personal leadership. The rivalry divided the court. Essex believed victory in Ireland would make him indispensable. Instead, the campaign unraveled. Rather than striking directly against O'Neill in the north, Essex spent months campaigning in the south, losing men to sickness, desertion, and scattered operations. His army shrank. Money vanished. Results disappointed the Queen. Elizabeth sent angry letters demanding action. Essex felt undermined and humiliated. Finally, he marched north and met O'Neill near the River Lagan. The two men held a private conference. A truce followed. To Elizabeth, the agreement looked like failure and possible disobedience. Then Essex made a disastrous decision. He abandoned his command and returned to England without permission. On the morning of September 28, 1599, he rushed into the Queen's private chamber at Nonsuch Palace before she was fully prepared to receive him. He had hoped for the emotional advantage of surprise, perhaps trusting in their old affection. For a moment, Elizabeth received him calmly. Later that day, the government closed around him. Essex was questioned and placed under confinement. The young favorite who believed personal access could overcome political failure discovered that the Queen's affection had limits. For months, he remained restricted. His offices and financial privileges were threatened. His supporters feared that Robert Cecil's faction would destroy them. Essex's debts mounted. His sense of grievance turned into desperation. In February 1601, he gathered followers at his London house. They claimed that enemies controlled the Queen and planned to ruin him. Essex marched into the city, hoping Londoners would rise in support. They did not. The streets did not become a revolution. The government blocked routes. Supporters slipped away. Essex returned to his house and surrendered. It was rebellion, confused and poorly planned, but rebellion nonetheless. He was tried for treason. Elizabeth once again faced the death of a man she had loved and favored. Essex was 35. On February 25, 1601, he was executed inside the Tower of London. Later stories claimed that Elizabeth had given him a ring he could return if he ever needed mercy, and that the ring failed to reach her because of court intrigue. The tale is powerful, but its historical basis is doubtful. The truth requires no invention. Elizabeth signed the warrant. The queen who had hesitated over Norfolk, Mary Stuart, and others finally allowed the execution of the last great favorite of her reign. His death did not restore the emotional world that existed before him. It revealed that the world was ending. That same year, Parliament confronted the Queen over monopolies. Members complained that privileges had become oppressive. The debate grew unusually bold. Elizabeth recognized the danger. She could have treated criticism as disloyalty. Instead, she withdrew many unpopular grants and addressed the members. In what became known as the Golden Speech, she thanked them for their loyalty and spoke of the love between Queen and people. She said that though God had raised her high, she counted the love of her subjects as the glory of her crown. The performance was masterful. Elizabeth did not surrender the principle of royal authority. She transformed retreat into generosity. She reminded Parliament that policy disputes existed inside a larger emotional bond. Many listeners were moved. It was one of her final great political victories. But in Ireland, the war continued. After Essex, Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, took command. He pursued a more systematic and ruthless strategy. English forces built garrisons, destroyed food supplies, targeted O'Neill's resources, and tightened pressure. Spain finally sent troops, landing at Calais in 1601. The location was far from O'Neill's northern base. Irish armies marched south through winter to join them. English forces besieged the Spanish position. In December, the Irish and Spanish attempted to break the siege. The Battle of Calais ended in defeat. Spanish troops surrendered. O'Neill retreated north. The rebellion weakened. The war's final stage brought devastation. Famine spread in affected regions. Civilians suffered from military destruction, displacement, and hunger. English victory was not a clean story of national defense. It was also the violent expansion of colonial power. Elizabeth would not live to hear O'Neill's final submission. It came only days after her death. By then, the Queen herself had entered a long decline. The portraits still showed an ageless face. The woman behind them could not escape time. Age did not arrive gently at the Tudor court. It announced itself through funerals. One by one, the people who had shaped Elizabeth's world vanished. Walsingham was gone. Leicester was gone. Hatton was gone. Essex was gone by her command. In August 1598, William Cecil died after nearly 40 years as her chief counselor. The loss was political and personal. Cecil had served Elizabeth from the beginning. He had argued with her, warned her, frustrated her, protected her, and built the administrative structure that allowed her caution to function as policy rather than chaos. He had not always trusted her instincts. She had not always followed his advice. Yet their long contest of judgment had become part of the machinery of the state. When he died, Elizabeth reportedly wept. His son Robert Cecil inherited much of his political position, though not the same intimate history. Small in stature, physically affected by spinal curvature, and often mocked by rivals, Robert Cecil possessed patience, secrecy, and a precise understanding of power. He also understood the question Elizabeth would not answer. Who would succeed her? By the end of the 1590s, few serious candidates could rival James VI of Scotland. He was Protestant. He was an experienced king. He was the son of Mary Stuart and the great-great-grandson of Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. But Elizabeth still refused to name him openly. So Robert Cecil began a secret correspondence with James. The exchange prepared a peaceful transfer while allowing Elizabeth to preserve the uncertainty that had protected her throughout her reign. James was advised to be patient, respectful, and careful not to demand what he expected to receive. The aging queen may have suspected more than she admitted. Her government was arranging the future around her silence. The silence had once been a weapon. Now it had become the final curtain behind which others prepared. Elizabeth's physical condition worsened. Her teeth had decayed, reportedly darkened by her fondness for sweet foods at a time when sugar was an expensive luxury. Dental pain and tooth loss affected her speech. Her hair had thinned. Wigs, cosmetics, elaborate collars, and jewels preserved the official image. At court, no one was permitted to speak plainly about age. The queen might joke about her years when it suited her, but others risked offense by recognizing them. Young courtiers continued to flatter her beauty. They called her Cynthia, Astrea, Gloriana, Belphoebe, names that lifted her out of time. This language was not simply vanity. The monarchy depended on continuity. Elizabeth's body was weakening, but the royal image had to remain whole. A visible decline could encourage factions to gather around the next reign. Illness could affect credit, diplomacy, military morale, and conspiracy. So the court danced around mortality. Musicians played, gowns glittered, poets praised eternal youth, and every informed observer waited for death. Elizabeth had always possessed remarkable energy. She rode hard, danced, hunted, walked, argued late into the night, and sometimes exhausted the people serving her. Her progresses required constant movement. Her temper could erupt with physical force. She might strike a courtier or throw an object when enraged, behavior accepted in a monarch that would have been condemned in almost anyone else. She also knew how to charm. Foreign ambassadors came prepared to negotiate and found themselves drawn into conversations about music, language, philosophy, clothing, marriage, and rumor. Elizabeth could switch languages, alter tone, and leave an envoy uncertain whether he had received a promise or merely an elegant sentence. Her indecision has often been criticized. Sometimes it was costly. Commanders waited for instructions. Allies doubted her. Military operations began without sufficient support. Ministers spent months trying to turn a royal hint into policy. But hesitation was not always weakness. Elizabeth had grown up in a world where final decisions killed people. She understood the value of keeping options open. A proposal that remained unresolved could still be traded. A suitor not rejected could still influence his government. A condemned prisoner not yet executed could still provide intelligence or leverage. An heir not named could not safely build an opposition court. Delay was her natural defense. The tragedy of her later years was that some problems could no longer be delayed. War required money. Ireland required armies. Poverty required policy. Succession required an answer. Time, once her ally, had turned against her. The court became increasingly tense and transactional. Access was sold through influence. Factions positioned themselves for James. Old loyalties weakened. The Queen sensed the change. She complained that people worshipped the rising sun. It was one of the loneliest truths of monarchy. A sovereign might command obedience for a lifetime, yet near the end, every ambitious person began looking beyond the throne. Elizabeth had made herself the center of the political universe. Now the planets were adjusting for a new sun. Still, she continued to perform the work of rule. She reviewed appointments. She met ambassadors. She examined accounts. She argued over military spending. She received news from Ireland and the continent. She touched subjects during royal ceremonies and appeared at public occasions when strength allowed. In 1602, she made a final great progress to Harefield, where entertainments celebrated her reign. The language was full of farewell, even when no one named it. The Queen, who had once entered London as a young woman of 25, now moved through a kingdom filled with people who had never known another monarch. 44 years on the throne had changed the scale of memory. For much of the population, Elizabeth was not one ruler among many. She was the shape of time itself. Children had become grandparents under her crown. Villages had watched generations pass beneath the same royal name. Sermons had prayed for her health for decades. Coins carried her face. Laws were dated by the years of her reign. Her unmarried body, once considered a temporary political problem, had become part of the national identity. But a kingdom cannot be married to a queen forever. Early in 1603, Elizabeth moved to Richmond Palace. Winter had been difficult. She appeared depressed. The deaths of friends, the execution of Essex, the endless war, and the knowledge of approaching mortality weighed upon her. She lost appetite. She slept poorly. She resisted doctors. She refused to take to bed for long periods, perhaps because a monarch in bed looked closer to death, and a dying monarch was vulnerable. Instead, she sat on cushions on the floor. Her ladies watched. Counselors waited outside. Rumors moved through London. Was the Queen dying? Had she named James? Would rival claimants act? Would foreign powers intervene? Would Catholics rise? Would the peaceful surface split the moment she stopped breathing? Robert Cecil worked quietly to ensure that it would not. The story of Elizabeth naming James on her deathbed is uncertain. Later accounts claim that when his name was mentioned, she made a gesture suggesting consent. She may have spoken. She may not have been able or willing to provide a formal declaration. The system around her no longer needed one. The council had prepared. On March 24, 1603, in the early hours of the morning, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. She had ruled for more than 44 years. There was no husband beside her. There was no child waiting outside the chamber. The Tudor dynasty ended in silence. Then the machinery of succession moved. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England. The son of the woman Elizabeth had inherited Elizabeth's crown. It was one of history's coldest reversals. Mary Stuart had lost her throne, her freedom, and her life. Her bloodline won. James's accession united the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch, though the kingdoms remained legally separate. Riders carried the news north. James began his journey to London. Courtiers turned toward him with astonishing speed. The transfer was peaceful. That peace was one of Elizabeth's greatest achievements, even though she had refused to name it openly. The succession crisis that had haunted the reign did not become civil war. The kingdom continued. Elizabeth's body was carried by barge to Whitehall and later taken through London in a grand funeral procession. A life-sized effigy lay upon the coffin, dressed in royal robes, crowned and holding the symbols of monarchy. Crowds lined the streets. Contemporary reports described widespread grief. People looked upon the image of the Queen even as her body lay hidden beneath it. The symbolism was perfect. Elizabeth the woman had died. Elizabeth the image remained above the crowd. She was buried in Westminster Abbey. James later placed a monument over her grave. In the same chapel lay Mary I, the sister who had imprisoned her. Elizabeth's inscription declared them partners in throne and grave. Nearby, Mary, Queen of Scots, would eventually receive an even more magnificent tomb, commissioned by her son. The queens who had spent their lives trapped in rivalry entered the afterlife as competing monuments. Death did not end the struggle over their stories. Almost immediately, people began turning Elizabeth's reign into legend. The contrast with James helped. A new monarch exposed what had been distinctive about the old. James was male, married, and a father. He spoke differently. He rewarded different people. He pursued peace with Spain. He brought a Scottish court into English politics. Subjects who had complained under Elizabeth began remembering her more warmly. Nostalgia polished the past. The Armada victory became larger. The failed English Armada faded. The theaters became symbols of national genius. The poverty, executions, censorship, and Irish devastation moved toward the edges of popular memory. The Virgin Queen became, almost, sacred. But Elizabeth's legacy cannot be understood through worship or condemnation alone. She inherited a dangerous throne and kept it. That achievement was not inevitable. In 1558, England was financially strained, religiously divided, militarily vulnerable, and overshadowed by France and Spain. Female rule remained contested. Elizabeth's legitimacy was denied by powerful enemies. The succession was uncertain. Scotland could serve as a route for French influence. Ireland remained resistant to English control. The Netherlands became a battlefield across the Channel. A weaker ruler might have been overthrown. A more reckless ruler might have pulled England into catastrophic war earlier. A more rigid ruler might have pushed religious division into civil conflict. Elizabeth combined intelligence, theatrical instinct, political caution, and an extraordinary ability to make subjects identify her survival with their own. She listened, though not always. She delayed, sometimes too long. She changed direction without admitting defeat. She turned gender from a vulnerability into a source of symbolic power. She made herself difficult to replace because no one could imagine the political world without her. Her religious settlement helped create a durable Protestant establishment. It did not produce full toleration. Catholics faced fines, surveillance, imprisonment, torture, and execution, especially when international conflict intensified. Puritans who demanded further reform also faced suppression. Elizabeth did not create modern religious freedom. She created a state church strong enough to survive her. Her reign saw Parliament gain experience in taxation, legislation, grievance, and debate. Yet Elizabeth defended royal prerogative fiercely. She imprisoned members who crossed boundaries. She controlled discussion of succession and religion. She did not intend Parliament to become sovereign. Still, the arguments of her reign did not disappear. Questions about taxation, monopoly, speech, religion, and royal authority would return under the Stuarts with greater force. Elizabeth held tensions together. She did not resolve them forever. The cultural achievements of the age were real. English drama, poetry, music, translation, and historical writing flourished. The language expanded through print, performance, travel, and education. Shakespeare's works do not belong to Elizabeth alone, but the world in which they emerged was shaped by the stability and contradictions of her reign. The stage could praise monarchy and expose its weakness in the same afternoon. That tension was Elizabethan. The maritime expansion was also real. English sailors mapped routes, challenged Iberian monopolies, developed naval experience, and imagined overseas colonies. The defeat of the Armada strengthened confidence and encouraged later generations to see the sea as the path to power. But the later British Empire was not created in 1588. Elizabethan ventures were uncertain, often unsuccessful, and deeply entangled with piracy, enslavement, violence, and the seizure of other people's lands. The first steps toward empire carried the moral failures that would grow with it. The story of Elizabeth cannot celebrate Drake without remembering those he attacked. It cannot celebrate Hawkins without remembering the Africans he enslaved. It cannot celebrate Virginia without remembering the indigenous societies English colonists intended to occupy. It cannot celebrate victory in Ireland without remembering famine, confiscation, and colonial war. A golden age for one group can be an age of terror for another. Elizabeth herself was neither the spotless heroine of national myth nor a simple villain controlling every act committed in her name. She was a monarch with immense authority operating through councils, commanders, local officials, parliaments, merchants, nobles, and systems she did not always fully control. She made choices inside constraints, and those choices changed lives. She approved expansion. She protected favorites. She resisted some executions and authorized others. She demanded economy while wars consumed men. She condemned rebellion while supporting rebels abroad when strategy required it. She spoke of love for her people while governments punished those considered dangerous. The contradictions were not separate from her greatness. They were the substance of it. Her most remarkable creation may have been herself. Elizabeth Tudor began life as the daughter of a queen erased from official legitimacy. She learned early that identity could be rewritten by law. One day she was a princess. The next she was illegitimate. One day her stepmother offered safety. The next a scandal placed her under interrogation. One day she rode beside Queen Mary. The next she entered the Tower as a suspected traitor. Nothing about status felt permanent. So when Elizabeth became queen, she built an identity that could resist change. She became the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the mother of the nation, the prince with the body of a woman, the ruler who existed above marriage and ordinary age. The portraits were not merely decoration. They were defenses against the instability she had known since childhood. And Boleyn had been destroyed by accusations about her body, marriage, and sexuality. Elizabeth made her own body politically untouchable. Henry VIII had discarded wives in pursuit of a son. Elizabeth refused to let a husband define her rule. Mary I had tied her government to a deeply unpopular foreign marriage. Elizabeth turned courtship into a weapon and remained sovereign. Mary Stuart had married for alliance, desire, and survival, only to see each marriage deepen her crisis. Elizabeth watched and chose absence. The choice preserved her independence. It also condemned her to uncertainty and, perhaps, loneliness. There were nights when the queen danced, until her legs ached, days when she rode through cheering crowds, and ceremonies where hundreds waited for a word from her. There were also rooms no public entered, rooms where letters from dead friends were kept, rooms where makeup concealed the marks of disease, rooms where advisors demanded the execution of a cousin, rooms where an aging woman heard that younger courtiers were already writing to the man who would replace her. Power surrounded Elizabeth with people. It could not protect her from isolation. That may be why the relationship between Elizabeth and her subjects became so important. She could not safely give herself to a husband. She could not trust a named heir. She could not rely on foreign allies. So she built a public marriage with the kingdom. It was political language. It may also have contained emotional truth. When she traveled, spoke, performed, and allowed crowds to approach, she did more than advertise authority. She sought recognition from the only partner she believed could not dominate her. Her people. Of course, her people did not speak with one voice. Some loved her. Some endured her. Some prayed for her death. Some died under her laws. Some profited from her favor. Some never saw her and knew her only from coins, sermons, proclamations, and rumors. The bond was imagined, but imagined bonds can hold kingdoms together. In 1588, when Elizabeth rode before the troops at Tilbury, the speech worked because it condensed 30 years of political performance into a few sentences. The young woman who had entered the Tower in fear now placed herself before an army. The princess once rejected as illegitimate now claimed the heart of a king. The queen accused of weakness because of her sex offered to die among armed men. The ruler who trusted almost no one declared trust in her people. That was the deeper victory at Tilbury. Before any Spanish soldier landed, Elizabeth had won the battle over what her body meant. The queen was not the weakness of England. She was England. Yet even the greatest performance cannot stop the next morning. The invasion passed. The war continued. Sailors died unpaid. Ireland burned. Harvests failed. Friends vanished. The favorite Essex walked to the scaffold. The queen who had become a symbol of timelessness sat on cushions at Richmond and refused to lie down. Perhaps she knew that once she entered the bed, the performance would end. Perhaps she knew that the crown was already moving north toward the son of Mary Stuart. Perhaps she simply feared death as any human being fears it. There is a temptation to search her final hours for a perfect sentence, one last declaration worthy of the legend. But the silence is more fitting. Elizabeth had survived through language. She had translated, argued, delayed, charmed, threatened, and reshaped reality through words. At the end, words could no longer protect her. The woman died. The story escaped. For centuries later, Elizabeth remains one of the most recognizable rulers in history. The red hair, the white face, the pearls, the enormous collars, the Armada, the unanswered question of marriage, the rivalry with Mary Stuart. Every generation creates its own Elizabeth. Victorians saw an imperial ancestor. Nationalists saw the queen who defied Spain. Writers saw a woman sacrificing private happiness for public duty. Critics saw religious persecution and colonial violence. Filmmakers saw romance, conspiracy, and transformation. Each image selects part of the truth. None contains the whole woman. The real Elizabeth was harder to capture because she spent a lifetime avoiding capture. When people demanded marriage, she gave them negotiations. When they demanded an heir, she gave them uncertainty. When enemies called her illegitimate, she gave them majesty. When age changed her face, she gave them an icon. When ministers demanded immediate action, she gave them delay until delay was no longer possible. She survived not by being simple, but by remaining unreadable. That unreadability was her shield. It is also why she still fascinates us. Was the Virgin Queen truly committed to remaining unmarried? Or did circumstance harden into identity? Did she love Robert Dudley? Or did she love the control their unfinished story gave her? Did she genuinely recoil from Mary Stuart's execution? Or did she arrange the outcome while protecting herself from blame? Was her caution wisdom, fear, manipulation, or all three? History rarely gives clean answers when a ruler worked so carefully to preserve ambiguity. But some conclusions are clear. Elizabeth inherited danger and turned it into endurance. She inherited scandal and turned it into image. She inherited a divided kingdom and left a state strong enough to pass peacefully to a new dynasty. She did not create a perfect age. No ruler does. Her reign contained art and hunger, courage and cruelty, survival and conquest. It opened doors to cultural greatness and to imperial violence. It protected England from invasion while extending English destruction elsewhere. It proved that a woman could rule in her own right while building that proof through a language that often borrowed the authority of kingship. Her success did not erase the prejudice she faced. It exposed it. Every time a council questioned whether a woman could decide, Elizabeth made them wait for her decision. Every time Parliament demanded that she marry, she reminded them that the crown was already complete. Every time foreign rulers treated her as a temporary obstacle, she outlasted them. Henry II of France died. Francis II died. Mary I died. Mary Stuart died. Philip II died. William of Orange died. Leicester died. Walsingham died. Burleigh died. Essex died. Elizabeth remained. For 44 years, remaining was the foundation of her power. Then, when she finally disappeared, the kingdom discovered how much of its identity had been built around her presence. The Tudor line ended, but the Elizabethan story had only begun. The crowns of England and Scotland passed to James. The conflicts over religion and royal authority continued. English settlement in Ireland intensified. Colonization in North America became permanent under the Stuarts. The commercial networks of Elizabeth's reign expanded into an empire she never saw. Shakespeare continued writing for a new king. The generation formed under Elizabeth carried its ambitions forward. Her reign was not a completed golden age sealed in 1603. It was a bridge. Behind it lay the dynastic violence of Henry VIII, the rapid reform of Edward VI, and the Catholic restoration of Mary I. Ahead lay union, colonization, constitutional conflict, civil war, and the rise of a global power. Elizabeth stood between those worlds. She did not know where the bridge would lead. No ruler ever does. On the field at Tilbury, soldiers saw a queen in armor and heard a promise that she would live or die among them. The Spanish never landed. The moment passed into legend. But the most important battle of Elizabeth's life had begun decades earlier, when a 2-year-old girl lost her mother and her title in the same year. From that moment, the world taught her that safety was temporary. She answered by making uncertainty her kingdom. She never gave England the husband it demanded. She never gave it the child it feared to live without. She never gave her enemies the simple mistake they needed. Instead, she gave the country time. Time to stabilize. Time to change. Time to imagine itself as something larger. And when her own time ended, the crown passed without the civil war so many had feared. That may be the final paradox of Elizabeth I. The queen who refused to settle the future spent her entire reign making sure the future could survive her. She entered history as the unwanted daughter of and Boleyn. She left it as the last Tudor. And between those two identities, she built one of the most powerful political performances the world had ever seen. Not because she never felt fear, but because she learned how to make fear serve the crown. Not because she never made mistakes, but because she survived enough of them to shape how they would be remembered. Not because her age was truly golden, but because she understood that nations, like queens, often live by the stories they tell about themselves. Elizabeth told England a story of courage, providence, loyalty, and exceptional destiny. The story concealed suffering. It inspired sacrifice. It justified power. It outlived her. And even now, when the painted eyes of the Virgin Queen look out from portraits made more than 400 years ago, they seem to ask the same question that haunted every courtier, ambassador, rival, and subject who stood before her. Where did the woman end and the legend begin?